Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to bring you an interesting story about Wall Street. And when I say interesting, it's probably even greater than that. Joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program today is our special guest, Mr. Guy Lawson. He was born in Toronto, and he owns degrees in the University of Western Australia and the University of Cambridge, England. And he is author of the book Octopus. It's a wonderful tale of intrigue and betrayal. When we talk about Wall Street, you're going to get a lot more than you bargained for. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today our guest, Mr. Guy Lawson. Guy, thank you for joining us here on the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, you write about a lot of different things. What made you go after this particular story here?
Well, Sam became notorious at the time that his hedge fund was exposed to be a $450 million hedge fund called Bayou, was exposed to be a Ponzi scheme or a fraud. It was the largest fraud on Wall Street ever. And so that was pretty remarkable. But then Sam was sentenced to 20 years, and instead of reporting to prison, he faked his own suicide by pretending to jump off Bear Mountain Bridge. And he left on the side of his car the words, "Suicide is painless." And this, there was something about Sam's story and the way he looked that really looked to me like he had something more to say. And I'd worked on Wall Street as a kid when I moved to New York as a lawyer, and I'd seen the possibilities for fraud. So I approached his defense attorney and then Sam and asked if he'd tell me his story, expecting it to be a Wall Street story, as you said in the intro. And Sam immediately took my pen and started to draw this graph on my pad of paper and tell me that there was another story, a completely different story that no one had ever heard about. And that's how I began to enter the world of the octopus. And I should say that what Sam was telling me was that basically the Federal Reserve is a Ponzi scheme, that everything that we know, that you know about the American government, about really reality and the financial system and the political system was all a great big con job, and that he glimpsed the truth underneath this the facade that we all embrace, this matrix-like truth. And 3 weeks after that, the global financial crisis hit. And you remember that moment when everything it was surreal? It seemed like there was no bottom to the crash and that there was no end to this kind of craziness.
Right.
That's when I thought, man, I've got to listen to Sam more carefully. This is a book here. And so that's when I sort of began to narrate the story and spent the next 2.5, 3 years reporting this book and examining all the documents related to Sam's story, and the nuttier it got, the truer it got, which was really a very strange trip.
I think that's funny when you take a look at something that tends to get so unbelievable that you go, this just has to be believable, where you know that truth is way stranger than fiction. And what's really interesting about this, Guy, is that it was probably just a couple of weeks ago that I decided to pick up a book that was called Mob's Son, and it's actually about Gregory Scarpa Sr., Gregory Scarpa Jr., okay?
I know the Colombo crime family story very well.
I'm sure you do because, as a matter of fact, I was finding myself even being reminded of it as I was reading through this. But that story didn't even touch a candle in some ways in reading as what you wrote here. I said, I love mobs and mob stories and Goodfellas and all that kind of stuff, but these guys pale sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes in comparison with what I was reading here about Sam Israel. It was just amazing what you were bringing up, and I thought to myself, the first question I wanted to ask was, you must have had a good, experience or language for finance, because you would have to a little bit to be able to talk about some of the things that you did, because I found myself at times, probably like a lot of people, were just went over your head. And even today, people are still trying to figure out what the heck was going on by 2008, where George W. Bush going out of office was saying, hey, we need about $700 billion to bail all these people out, and nobody can still figure out what the hell was really going on in the first place.
Sam, there's a term for mobsters. They're wise guys. But Sam went to work on Wall Street. He discovered that the people he was consorting with were smart guys. They were way smarter than the wise guys. So there's this. There are elements of Wall Street that look an awful lot like an organized crime conspiracy. And you see that in the headlines this week with this interest rate scandal over in London. It's mystifying. How do they set these interest rates? What happened to that $700 billion? And I can tell you one thing for sure, that the truth, which is to say the interior reality that is experienced by Wall Street's highest people, is not in the public sphere. That these things are done behind closed doors and with tacit arrangements and self-serving side deals. And, that's what Sam understood that. Sam had lived through that. He grew up in one of the most prominent trading families in the country, and he'd seen how, his father, growing up, his father was friends with Alan Greenspan and Larry Tisch and Sandy Weil, these very powerful people, and he'd seen how events are shaped and molded by the powerful. And so, when Sam got involved in his own set of lies and his own fraud and Bayou, it was natural for him to believe that everything is a lie, or it wasn't hard for him to believe that, and that's how he in turn got conned himself.
What I really like, too, is the way it unfolded when it really picks up from the 1980s. Now, I had actually read The Snowball, which is the biography about Warren Buffett. And what was fascinating about that is how he came into the game, of course, as a great investor, but he started back in the 1940s. And so the woman who had actually wrote his story, which was blessed by Warren Buffett to do so, was a prominent writer, had been in the financial services industries for, a good couple of decades, especially in the realm of insurance. She had a really good language for not only describing the financial, wherewithal, if you want to, but being able to put it to where people could understand what she was talking about. But what was neat was to watch the evolution of finance from, again, the 1940s. We're going back to around the Great Depression, and the evolution of it. And you could see as she was unfolding the story about Warren Buffett that by the 1970s, the landscape began to change, and you could feel the sense of greed was really seeping in. Not that it wasn't there before. And then by the 1980s, it was becoming real self-absorbed and selfish. It was taking on this arrogance, sort of a thing. And by the 1980s, how your story comes in and it kind of picks that up and says, it was a free-for-all. Wherever there's a pile of money, you're just going to find some very unscrupulous things going on, and that's exactly what was going on here.
Yeah, I studied law, and I worked on Wall Street, so I had some understanding of the language of investment. But what surprised me in reporting this book was the extent to which technology also played a role.
Right.
So Warren Buffett was an investor. Sam was a trader.
Right, big difference.
Yeah, Sam didn't care about what the company did. He just cared about the movement of the market in incremental little ticks every minute, every hour. And so, you start to get separated from the underlying reality of what the company's doing, whether it matters what it's doing, what the product is. And so computers enabled traders to do that just infinitely more quickly and in infinitely more complicated ways. And so Sam tried to master those computers. He created a program he called forward propagation,
right,
which kind of sounds biblical and musical and mathematical, and really it never really worked. He tried to make it work. Sometimes it worked, but it never did what he said he could do. But this is the kind of thing that is still, to this day, really the underlying truth of Wall Street is that there's trillions of dollars moving around every day, the Dow going up and the S&P, based on these computer programs which can run amok and really are, not related to the truth as Warren Buffett, for example, experienced it through his career.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a disturbing trend, and I think it's only getting more and more abstract and more opaque and more difficult to understand what's going on. And, one of the things that Sam's advice to investors is if you can't understand it, don't invest in it. And that was the thing with Bayou. People couldn't understand it when they didn't understand what Sam was doing, and that's one of the ways he was such an effective con man. And here's the irony: is that when Sam himself got conned by this CIA agent who he met at the height of his Ponzi scheme, desperate to save his life and desperate to save his fund, Sam was trying to find a way to make $200 million very, very quickly. Mm-hmm. This is a distinction I would like to make between Bernard Madoff, who never traded at all, and Sam Israel, who was a real human being and really trying to solve his problem. Madoff was just like a reptile. And so Sam, Sam was, trying desperately to find a solution, but he could never explain what it is. This CIA guy convinced him that there's a secret bond market run in London by the Federal Reserve, and that the Federal Reserve is a Ponzi scheme and all these really seemingly crazy things. But the further I researched them, the more time I spent reporting on them, the more that I found that the CIA agent, a guy named Robert Booth Nichols, was part of a much larger world, an entire universe of what you would call high-yield or prime bank fraud. It's a very complicated and nuanced con game, but it's a con game nonetheless.
Now, talking about Mr. Nichols, when you bring that name up, I was going to kind of save that because that's where it really gets juicy. Okay?
Yeah. Sure.
Now, what I love about how this story opens up is I started remembering, for instance, the movie Boiler Room, how the movie starts out where you see these guys on the bus, they're shooting craps, they're drinking, they're doing drugs. They hit the hotel, you see them making a mad dash like wildebeest over to the bar. They're slamming down doubles and triples of scotch and you name it, hoarding, the buffet bar, the whole bit. I mean, just the excesses. And that's what was going on a lot here, especially with Sam Israel and the lifestyle that he had. You talk about, for instance, that they removed themselves from what the company even did. It was all about making the money. It was all about, scalping the trade, for instance, and how he learned his chops. He really had, for instance, a strong desire to break away from his family, his father, to do something on his own. So he had a real hungry motivation to do that. Now, you can see how that kind of changes the way he is. And people, they think, these people on Wall Street, why do they do this? Why do they do what they do without any concern for instance, the millions of people that may be losing their retirement funds? Well, you kind of show how that really happens, how there's such a tremendous indifference, so to speak. Yeah. But how this con guy eventually sets himself up to be conned, and you introduce somebody. And I couldn't believe this when I read this. This book really, like I said, this read better than a mob story to me. Now, you said you had to change some of these names, correct?
Yes, correct.
Okay. But I have to know if this was the real name of this guy, Jack O'Halloran.
It is.
And I read this, folks. Now, listen, if anybody's seen the movie Superman 2, there's the three villains. He's the big oafy one. And this was the guy that introduced Sam to Jack.
He's not associated with the con, but it's true to say that he introduced Sam to this world.
Yeah, you look at this guy and go, okay, he was a nobody. To me, you'd think he was just a nobody actor in a movie back in the early 1980s, but the story about this guy was like, I'll never look at that movie and see him the same way again, ever.
Yeah, it's almost like every time that, so Jack O'Halloran, he meets Sam and he says, I was supposed to fight Muhammad Ali, and
right.
I actually fought George Foreman, I think it was, in the Madison Square Garden. It sounds crazy, but it's true.
Right.
And then Jack O'Halloran says, I was in Superman, and it sounds nutty, but it's true.
Right.
And then he says, I was in Dallas the day that JFK was shot, and I know who shot him. And I don't think that's true. So Sam really sort of, imagine how much trouble you can get into with $150 million in cash.
You
and
can.
Sam's come back with the answer, and it's a lot.
Right. Right.
So yeah, he really, Robert Booth Nichols is a true name, and if your listeners Google him up, you'll see that he's a superstar of the conspiracy theory world. He really is this shadowy figure, or was. He's supposedly dead, although Sam is convinced he faked his own death.
Mm-hmm.
He was this. He seemed to just personify everything that was mysterious and inexplicable about American sort of intelligence world, the stuff in the 1980s and 90s, particularly with things like Iran-Contra, the October surprise, the way that drugs were being dealt by the CIA, the way that money was secretly funneled into Swiss accounts. Robert Booth Nichols, in 2004, approached through Sam George W. Bush's cousin, a guy named John Ellis, and your listeners may remember him as the Fox News analyst who called the election for President Bush in 2000. Mm-hmm. John Ellis became a venture capitalist person in New York and was working with Sam. They knew each other from their son's schools, Robert Booth Nichols approaches John Ellis with Sam and says, I know where Osama bin Laden is hiding. He's in Pakistan, and the Pakistani army are hiding him.
Right.
In 2004.
Yeah.
Now, I can't answer the question. I didn't get the chance to talk to Mr. Nichols, but I can tell you that there's a lot of smoke here, and there's a lot of entertaining anecdote, but also a lot of interesting information related to kind of a counter history of the United States.
Uh-huh. Well, I know when again, as I was reading through the Octopus, fascinating stuff. It makes me be compelled to want to read different elements of this because, like I said, it reads better than a mob story in many ways because this is supposedly legal activity, but it takes an illegal bent. And we say to ourselves, well, if we're going after people like, for instance, Bernie Madoff for Ponzi schemes, how is this any different than what our government and even world governments are allegedly doing when it all pretty much not only looks the same, but actually has some really weird bends to where it's even worse?
How is it that John Corzine can lose $1.5 billion? He just vanishes, and he's unprosecuted.
Right.
How is it that the Federal Reserve can just print money from here to the end of time and with no gold or anything underneath it? These are the questions that Sam poses, and I think they're very interesting questions.
Mm-hmm.
The essence of Octopus is it asks questions, and hopefully in an entertaining way. My last book was called The Brotherhoods, and it was about it's a true story about two New York City policemen, detectives, who were hitmen for the mafia. And that was a big case here in New York, and it's being developed for a movie, and that was an incredible story. But this one is even more incredible.
Mm.
This is the true mob.
Well, there's no doubt about it. If anybody even knows anything about Gregory Scarp, as I mentioned earlier in the program, Senior, is that this guy had a carte blanche to be able to go and just pretty much do whatever he wanted. What made him fascinating was the multiple lives that this guy led while keeping himself pretty much held together. Where Sam, you could see he was kind of unraveling, and his motivation was to try to get the Bayou hedge fund that he had created, that instant cash to put in there, and the way that he was just being worked by Robert Booth Nichols was quite amazing. I mean, he put him on the verge of literal paranoia, and as you were talking about, it began to take on elements, or, the sting. You even talk about the big con of which the movie was made after. And that, there it is. It's just so classic to see that this is going on and that a con can be conned, and you describe why elements like that are very possible.
Yeah, the thing, you can't con an honest man. And it follows from there, if you think about it, that it's easy to con a dishonest man. And so...
You can't BS a BSer, but that's not true. You can BS the heck out of them.
That's exactly so. Only a BSer can really, truly be BS, especially one who's so enveloped by their own lies that they've sort of lost the ability to tell the difference, like where their lies end and where the truth begins. So Sam would tell stories about his escapades, and you wouldn't know exactly where it began and ended, and that's why I spent so much time documenting what he did and being very careful reporting the facts. Mm-hmm. But yeah, Nichols really, in a certain sense, took control of Sam's mind. He controlled him. He was his handler. And so this is a man who described himself as an assassin and a trained, killer, a person who was, access to the White House, a person who was connected to the Trilateral Commission. Nichols portrayed himself as this very, very highly elite operative. And, the thing that's bizarre about this is, the federal government, the prosecutors and the FBI never even released his name as it related to Sam Israel's case. And there was some litigation related to Nichols to try to get some money back from him, but all of that was placed under seal by federal prosecutors and a federal judge. His name had never even been mentioned in public until today, until yesterday. Mm-hmm. It was, essentially this story was suppressed, and now it's coming out. Mm-hmm. So, there's just an awful lot of interesting information, and I think questions that are posed by Octopus.
Book is Octopus. Our guest today, author Guy Lawson. Now, here's the thing: you see a lot of movement against Wall Street, and it's like more and more information, especially I would say over the last 5 years, maybe even 10 years, we can go that far, that people are becoming more aware of what's going on, and now you see, for instance, the Occupy movements that have been going on. Is there any way, because when you look at this, it really just, it goes down the rabbit hole. It's the way it is. We've actually had E.F. Griffith, for instance, who wrote the book Creature from Jekyll Island, and I began to look into this about 7 years ago, and it can be easy to be caught up in the conspiracies, but I think that becomes the danger, that if you get caught up in that you start losing the sense of reality and how sometimes thin this veil really is. That with these Occupy movements and with people arming themselves with good information to intentionally do what they believe is the right thing for the greater good, do you see that actually happening, or is this something that no matter how many people try to do or change, that it just may elusively get worse?
I think it's a crucial moment and a good question you asked.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's key to be able to keep a couple things in mind. That because conspiracy theories can drive you nutso doesn't mean that there are no real world conspiracies.
Right.
Because there is a known reality doesn't mean there is an unknown reality. And that's the valuable thing that I see Occupy Wall Street doing, the smarter ends of it, is calling into question basic institutions and trying to make them accountable for their behavior.
Of course.
And that is all to the good. My fear, though, of course, is that these things are only getting more complicated and more opaque. When I worked on Wall Street, and part of what qualified me to write this book was that I'd worked with these documents, these complicated documents. What I worked on was a thing called mortgage-backed securities. Now, this was in the early 90s, and this was a brand new financial instrument or structure. And, the idea basically was to bundle together thousands of mortgages and then sell the payments that people were making on their mortgages on as securities to large investors. Mm-hmm. And it was all done in private placements. Well, this is the thing that blew the economy up. It fueled the housing bubble, and it nearly destroyed the economy in 2008. And that was part of that was because they kept getting more and more complicated, more and more difficult for anyone, even those involved in the transactions, to really understand. And so, in some sense, Octopus is the personification of that craziness. If you can't understand something, there's something wrong with that. Mm-hmm. And so, to the extent that Wall Street still mystifies people, I think it's incumbent on all of us to educate yourself about your investment, to make sure that you read your financial statements carefully, because that's one thing Sam was very good at, was hiding lies inside financial statements. And then, in turn, to not just accept at face value things that you're told by powerful forces. Mm-hmm. But I would also advise people not to go into business with Robert Booth Nichols.
Unless you wanted to get into writing cloak and dagger novels anyway. Like I said, you read this and it leaves you scratching your head like, well, hey, especially that black shadow market, you can immediately feel like, boy, this guy's getting sucked in by, like a lot of people could, by the lure of easy money. I mean, really, 100% returns on your money within a week. And you don't see a problem here.
Yeah. The amazing thing about it is, so I traveled to Europe multiple times to report for the book.
Right.
And I encountered a gentleman there who's a true world Viscount. A lot of these people were, false royalty and fake, belonging to elite clubs and things. But this was the real deal. And he showed me how Sam Israel's participation in this market was used as a marketing tool to attract other wealthy people. Mm-hmm. And so the fact that there's this great New York hedge fund trader involved in it also was used to attract less sophisticated investors, people with high net worth individuals, many of them with money that they'd hidden from the authorities in Swiss bank accounts. And that there's a third level to this con. There's Sam Israel, the con man. There's Robert Booth Nichols, who conned Sam Israel. And then there's a third character whose name I had to change because he's a real person, who conned Robert Booth Nichols and many other people out of money too. So it really does just keep traveling down this rabbit hole until you really can get that sense of surreality that really swallowed Sam up, that carried him away in its tentacles, and that's the octopus.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you take a look at the ocean, there's always a level of predatory fish.
That's right.
One's bigger than the next.
That's right, and Sam was the biggest whale in town.
Fascinating book. Give us a website people can find out more about your work and about this book, Octopus.
If you go to GuyLawson.com, that's my website. It's GuyLawson.com. There's links there to lots of my prior work. There's also links to places to buy the book. And at my Facebook page, which is Guy Lawson, if you just Google that up, put that into the Facebook search, GuyLawson, you'll get to my page, and there's lots of extra stuff. And I've got a whole bunch of stuff I'm going to be posting in the next little while: classified documents, FBI sealed reports, sealed testimony, affidavits. So you'll be able to engage with the primary material and see just how incredibly redacted and controlled the information about Mr. Nichols is, for example, or see the statements where Sam really did wire $150 million to Europe, and see that this stuff, as crazy as it sounds, really did happen.
And the most fascinating part about what Octopus presents to the reader is something that you've actually said here at least a couple of times, especially toward the end of the program, is that when you see these news reports about all these people losing millions of dollars in their retirement, you have to ask, okay, well, what part of this were they really responsible for? And the fact is, they picked up a pen. What was their motivation when they made their signature on the dotted line? How much did they really look into what they were getting involved with? And this was something that I started doing 10 years ago for myself, and I realized we're 100% responsible for being screwed when it comes to our own money. And sure, these people, on Wall Street that were, pointing our fingers and saying those are the bad guys and they owe us, yeah, they've done a lot of things they should be accountable for, but what was your role in that accountability as well? And that's what I like about a book like Octopus. It begins to get you to raise the questions about your own motivations and to hopefully make better choices, especially when it comes to your own money.
Yeah, if you're counting on regulators or gatekeepers and banks to look out for you, then you really better think again.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of wolves out there, and there's a lot of, predatory fish in that sea, so to speak. And if anything else, there's a lot of books about how to get rich. If you read Octopus just as a reverse investment guide, what not to do, what to look for.
And go see Superman 2. You'll be amazed. Guy, I want to thank you so much. I wished we had another 30 minutes to have you on the program, but I know that you got to get going. One more time, go ahead and give out your website.
It's GuyLawson.com. That's GuyLawson. And if you enjoyed this show, please friend me on Facebook.
Very good. Guy, thank you again for joining us here on the Beyond 50 radio program.
Thank you so much for having me.
You got it. Again, the book is Octopus. Be sure to visit us at our website at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do have a free weekly e-newsletter. We'll also have a hot link for you as well. I'm Daniel Davis. Again, thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program. And remember, live your day past halfway.